Welcome back to Naval Action and episode 45 of A Letter to the King. If you're new to the series, this is my attempt to keep us up to date with what's going on predominantly in the port battle and PvP arenas on Euro PvP 1. And before we get into what sort of malarkey was going on this week, let's remind ourselves of what was happening towards the end of last week. So last week the Swedes had spread a little bit along the coast here. This had been the main sort of movement down in this quarter of the map where it's all been going on. The Americans had retaken Islamabad, and I think that was about it. It was a bit of a quiet one for actual captures. There was loads of battles, but a bit of a quiet one for actual captures. Not what happened this week. There was a lot of captures this week. Now the alliances seem to have finally stabilised. I think we need to wait one more week to make sure they've got this quadrella sorted out, but it now appears that the voting timelines and the gaps are aligned, but one more week before we can tick that box. So what happened this week? Well, the answer is a lot happened this week. Almost a guaranteed start to the week at the moment is the exchange of Islamadora. So the Americans were there in defence. The Spanish turned up. I don't think I've got the full details on this one. I'm not sure the Americans managed a full fleet. The Spanish, however, and I hope I'm not dissing them there by saying it wasn't against a full American fleet. The Spanish, however, now have Islamadora back, and this seems to be the one that rankles the Spanish. Every time this gets taken, they're quick to trot to take it back. So the Spanish were victorious there. And the now I think it was a French and Swede mob. It was under a French flag that had a go at the Brits down in the Windward Islands, and this was quite an epic fight. In the end, the video's up there on the channel. If you watch it though at the 30 to 40 minute mark, it looked real trouble for the Brits, but some good leadership and a little bit of patience waiting for the wind to be in the right position. The French got stuck into the brawl and somewhat gave up the wind in their excitement. At one point I think they were like 450 to about 50 up, but in the end it turned into a bit of a spanking with I think the Brits lost maybe 5 or 6, and 3/4 of the French-Swedish fleet was sunk. So that was a good win for the Brits there, and that was the first time I've seen a fleet rock up, and I suspect it wasn't all top of the line port battle build. I just, the French and the Swede side seemed to melt a little bit more quickly than normal. So I was speaking about attrition not really playing a part last week. Well, maybe it's not quite true. I know at the moment, if you're building first rates and you want to put stiffness on them, for example, that's quite a lot of compass wood, and compass wood is the new thing that's hard to get. You only get compass wood when you farm another forest, and it's like 5%ish of what you farm. So compass wood is the new gold, as it were. And so let's see if we start getting sort of suboptimal port battleships appearing. Attrition could now become, not so much it's hard to get a first rate, but maybe it's going to become a little bit harder to get hold of a fancy pants first rate. So what else happened? Well, there's been a bit of malarkey going on this week. If we go back a couple of weeks, the Americans were very annoyed that the Danes broke a Christmas Day, an Orthodox Christmas Day truce, and triple attacked the Americans. And the Americans are probably more active now than they have been for the best part of 6 months. And their position would be you reap what you sow, or you reap what you sow. I think the Danes are, well, I know the Danes are not overly happy at all with attacks that you might call night flipping. The Americans decided to cause any stay up late Danes or their allies to have to split their attention between two very important ports. the Santo Domingo, which is their stronghold region, and Savannah, which is their live oak port. Now, the Danes have probably got more live oak than you can shake a stick at, to be honest. But nonetheless, both of these ports were hit in American prime time, but that's horrible o'clock for the Danes. And then I was a little bit interested in what happened, because they actually had ships in both ports. They had about 14 or 15 ships in both ports. This was seen by the Americans as a suicide distraction. The Americans rocked up to both of them, and rather than have 25 first rates in one and then, scruffs in the other, they sort of had 14 or 15 in both, maybe a bit less down in Santo Domingo. And as a result, much to the Americans' laughter and surprise, the Danes lost both ports. So I have a great deal of sympathy with folks being night flipped, but I also have a great deal of sympathy for the Americans. I mean, the fact that the Danish truce breaker didn't actually result in ports changing hand is only because a lot of the US allies turned up to help repel the attacks. But nonetheless, we'll talk a little bit more about night flipping later on, and I think we as a bunch of gamers need to perhaps do something about this. But anyway, let us see. The Swedes then had to defend Port-au-Prince from a pirate attack, and defend it they did. And by the way, I think the Swedes, possibly the Swedes, it may have been the Spanish in a couple of Islamadoras, they're beginning to show the value of fire ships and then boarding mods. So if you can get a fire ship to blow up, say just within 3 or 4 enemy ships in the explosion circle, if you've then got half a dozen ships tooled up for boarding, you can quickly grab up 3 or 4 ships with very little threat to yourself. You're going in with 150 Marines and 550 crew against perhaps 300 crew. So it's become a bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a guaranteed tactic, but it's certainly a strong tactic. It works particularly well in the 4th rates, where you're much more maneuverable, so being able to get to a ship that's perhaps lost some sail capability and has also decrewed is a little bit easier than it is with the 1st rates. And I also think positioning a 1st rate so it can get a fire ship off tends to be a little bit harder, because there tends to be a little bit more line sailing going on. So if you're in a line and a fire ship comes towards you, you have to be pretty clever to let 4 ships get snotted by it. The pirates were repelled from Port-au-Prince. Then there was another pirate action. Now I think this was just a funky one. We keep getting this every now and again at Exumar or whatever it's called up here near where the small ship PvP takes place, the shallow water PvP. And I think this might have just been because the pirates like their PvP circles. I'm not sure if they just tipped this port through the PvP that went on, or if it was a deliberate tip. But nonetheless, a very small number of pirates rocked up in their little rattles and were easily repelled by the Brits. And then midweek, perhaps the big move of the midweek is that a Swede, and it was an alliance, it wasn't just the Swedes, led fleet had a crack at the Dutch in, I think this is Kumana. And despite there being a considerable defensive force for the Dutch, both in the port and outside the port. Outside the port, one captain pulled off the tag that sucks in the whole screening fleet due to the circle of stupid being half the size of the map. And the opposing fleet then had free entry to the port. And it was worse than free entry to the port because the wind was very much against the defenders. It was blowing them back into their port. And probably 45 minutes into the battle, 30 minutes into the battle, when the wind changed and the defenders had taken a gamble and headed in a particular direction, and as they began their move to close in on the opponents and bring the brawl to a contested circle, the wind began to move again, and it moved against them. And I know the captains in there literally felt it was as if the wind was like the 26th ship. The attackers knew what they were doing, and they took full advantage of this, and they ended up capturing the port. I don't think there were that many ships lost, to be honest. Maybe half a dozen between both fleets. So it was very much a points victory. But the Dutch lost another port, and now the Swedes are spreading their wings. And the French and the Swedes between them now have eaten up a lot of this coastline. The Spanish had to defend the Brits at, what's this one called? Costa de Calos or something around here. I don't think I've ever even been up this neck of the woods myself. And that may have been a problem for the Brits because I don't think anyone else had, and very few Brits turned up, and the Spanish easily repelled them. And then an oddball one, the French, what are you doing, France? They had a crack at Pedro Cay, a crack at Pedro Cay. I don't know what Pedro Cay is. It's not much of a contested port these days. It used to be the British silver mines and the redwood logs from memory. Now the French, I don't know how they did it. There was a ring of screeners, and the French just rocked up, and they were right next to the port. However, there was quite a lot of British ships sitting just on the edge of the shallows, and I think 16 of the 8 ships were stopped from entering, something to that order. And then the ships in the port basically got slaughtered. So that ended up being an easy defence for the Brits. The Americans, never one to leave a wound unsalted, then had another crack at the Danes in La Vega. And this was actually a really good battle. There's a video of this up. This was actually a really well contested battle. A couple of explosions, quite a bit of boarding, and in the end the Danes were vanquished. So the Danes have been vanquished from Haiti. These were ports that they took from allies, I'm pretty sure, when they'd fallen out of an alliance. So the Americans, very unusual to see green down this end of the map, eh? The Americans have now snagged up the east side of Haiti. So Haiti, and I don't think I've ever seen this, is now held by a coalition of pirates, Swedes, French and Americans. So this was normally, you'd have seen maybe Danes, some Brits, some Spanish, and maybe the odd pirate port. The Dutch were there in the previous war. And there's a lot of good biffo going on around these ports, apart from maybe this one at 3 o'clock in the morning for the defenders. The Danes then had to defend Ponce, and the Danes like Ponce. They love the name of the port, and they turned up in a healthy looking fleet, and I think it was a Dutch-led attack, and the Dutch were well repelled from Ponce. And yes, it's a long week, isn't it? Now, towards the end of the week, the Swedes were met by the British at Orinoco. The first time the Brits have had a go at Orinoco. And Orinoco is quite a hard port to get to. You sort of have to sail into a bit of an estuary below a spit. And unfortunately for the Brits, the screeners managed to eat about a third of the British fleet. This has led to a bit of consternation in the British nation, because the British at the moment, they sort of, 2/3 of them at least, hold this policy of not logging out at sea and logging back in. And to be honest, if they'd have done that, they'd have got into the port. And the probably third of Brits who don't agree with that was somewhat annoyed that, you know, everyone else does it, so why not us? There was great suspicion that the French did it below Pedro Cay. I'm sure I'll get 37 things telling me they didn't, but it certainly felt like it. 20 people magically appeared on the people online, and 1 minute later the French had somehow slipped through the screeners. But maybe it was a brilliant bit of sailing. And then the Orinoco port itself is one of the ports with the 3 circles in a line, which basically means you're going to have a huge brawl in the outer circle depending on where the wind is, and then if you lose that brawl, you lose the port. But because the Brits only had 16 ships in, 3 of which proved to be rather non-optimally used fire ships, so they ended up with like 13 ships. It was an easy defence for the Swedes. I can't remember how many they killed. It wasn't that many, maybe 5 British ships got sunk, something to that order. The Brits then had to defend the French again on their bi-weekly trip to Castries. And this was the only port battle on of the day. I would estimate there would have been 150 captains between the Allies and the attackers screening and counter-screening. There was battles that went on the full 90 minutes. The entire French port battle fleet got pulled in. 3 or 4 stragglers managed to get through and into the port, but they did the right thing and ran away and escaped, so it proved to be a very easy defence for the Brits. The Dutch then went back after Pampatã. This is their sort of almost an ancestral home for the Dutch. It used to be a super key strategic port. And this was reasonably late, but it wasn't like stupid o'clock late. Now, there was a couple of battles down here that were late, and I just want to let the Allies, the Alliance know, the French-Swedish alliance, that the attacks on Orinoco, Trinidad, and Pampatã, they were all after the battle where the French or Swedes, whoever it was, took Cumana. And while we were running up the hostility, we were getting countered, and this meant that Cumana pushed the start time back an hour, and then the counter pushed us back 20, 30, 40 minutes. So they were a little bit later, but given they were in the middle of the weekend, I don't think these go into the same category as some of these. And the Dutch won Pampatã back because the Danes had very few ships in here at all. Maybe it was too late and they were really pissed off because of what had happened up here, but they had very few ships in here, and this was a very easy win. And then the Brits went at Trinidad for what must be the 13th time, and they got their whole fleet in pretty much. I think 23 ships got in. And then they were met by the most obscure ragtag force you've ever seen. And this one wasn't too late. It was about the same time that the French attacked Castries today. But it was a bizarre old fleet. There was like 5 or 6 first rates. Then there was like half a dozen fourth and fifth rates. There's even a couple of Indiamans and 3 mortar brigs. Now, I do know that when the French were trying to screen the Brits coming in, part of their port battle fleet did get included in the tag, and I wonder if they struggled to get out in time and then just other screeners jumped in to try and fill the void. But this was a very one-way port battle, and the Brits pretty much killed everything in there, bar the half handful that managed to escape. So at last, this lovely set of islands has been taken by the Brits, and when the Brits only held Bridgetown, the goal here was to try and get Trinidad as a backup. So if the French pushed us out of Castries, we'd have this backup, so we can help with our Dutch colleagues on their flank here. But now we've got all 3. We're pretty happy chappies down in Bridgetown. Now this week was not only a whole pants load of port battles. There was almost, and this was organised by one of the American chaps, a bit of a diplomacy summit. It was held in the middle of the weekend. It was a horrible o'clock for me, and all the nations were invited. Spain couldn't get there, and pirates either weren't invited or didn't send anyone or couldn't send anyone. Not quite sure, but. This is up. It's on my channel. You can have a look at the video of this captain's table, headed by his face palmness himself. And look, I'll be honest, because I'm quite active on the forums and I'm quite active chatting around. I have to say a lot of what was spoken about has been spoken about before. So there were no enormous eureka moments. But for me, the things I got out of it were this in general. So first of all, most of the people at the table, if not all the people at the table, were at the table as gamers. And the commonality of concerns was just the standout feature of the night. When one of the Danish lads was talking, he could have been one of the British guys, the way he was describing the things he did and didn't like about RVR right now. So people weren't coming too heavily wearing their nationally tinted goggles. There was a little bit of it. The second thing, I think, is there is simply an intractable difference between, certainly France, Spain weren't there. The Danes weren't as strong on this. and the Swedes didn't speak as strongly. I'm sure they have sympathy to the French plight, but the French basically see any port battle that's instigated out time of their sort of core 7 till 11 p.m. play time as just dirty play. That's simple as that. Or the representative for the French. That everybody here is not a duly elected representative. They're people who turned up. There was 2 or 3 from each nation, predominantly. So they don't. If you're French and this person you didn't agree with, I'm not saying he carries your view in any legal document, but they are representative of the French nation, and there were many of them were the diplomats and the likes. And the French basically, any attack between 7 and 11 was seen, not between 7 and 11 was seen as a bad thing. The American proposition here, and players from other time zones, is, well, it's always night for somebody. It's a round world, and it's always night for somebody. And if the Americans are only ever allowed to attack in French prime time, then they can't play on this server, predominantly. So that was definitely an intractable difference between us all. And I think the other thing is that stood out, we all kind of love the game, but we all really want them to fix some of the things that, and a few, I was watching the chat, a few people have quite rightly been saying that some of these things have been there for a year and the devs don't listen and so on and so forth. So we have put a bit of a summary page together. I'm leaving it up there for comments in the diplomacy thread in the forums. And I will send it on to the mods and the devs, and I don't know if they'll just eat it or throw it away or use it to block a draft below the toilet door, who knows. But I will send it on. But here's the sort of the summary, if you like, the executive summary from the captain's table. So there is a general question that says, well, we have to be careful that when we're asking for rules changes, that we think about a game that's got a full server rather than a game with 400 servers. So everybody agreed with that. There was a very strong feeling that we need to incentivize new players to join the smaller nations. Now, this doesn't mean you block them from joining the stronger nations, because people, the devs have decided to have national affiliation. I was born in England, so I am drawn to the Brits. You were perhaps born in Spain, so you will be drawn to the Spanish. But there are lots of Americans who I've seen in, not lots, but there's Americans I've seen in some of the enemy alliances from the Brit perspective. There's Germans who play with the Brits. There's Brits who play with the Swedes, and so on and so forth. So it would be good if we incentivize people to join the smaller nations. So if you can imagine, when you hit create, a little table pops up. It could show the 8 nations, and maybe the smallest nation gets a 20% bonus for gold and XP that is won through PvP, whereas the largest nation gets a 20% discount on said rewards. So that might tempt people to go and play. And of course it would be dynamic, so if everybody rushed to Sweden, then the bonus would go to the next smallest nation, and so on and so forth. And you could scale it. It could be 20% for the 2 smallest, 10% for the next 2 smallest, minus 10 for the next 2 biggest, and minus 20 for the 2 biggest, and so on and so forth. So it would be good. I'd also like it to be harder and more costly to then change nation, just so you don't go and level up with the Swedes and then switch over to the Brits or whatever. That's less likely to happen, because I think most of us will agree we predominantly play this game because of the friends we sail with. And if you levelled up to Rear Admiral or levelled your crafting up or whatever, you will have bound to have made friends on your server. I think incentivise. I think really for a lot of our problems, and especially to do with night flipping, we need a clear statement from the devs in their mind's eye when they imagine this game is live in a year and they've got 3 full servers running. Please God, let them have 3 full servers running. Will their servers be in different time zones, or will their servers essentially be global servers? So it is valid for an American to try and take a port at American prime time on a global server, and tough titty if it's your port. So we really need this answer from the devs, because otherwise it slants how you would fix it. We'll come to that in a moment. There was huge agreement that the rules of engagement, especially near port battles, are stupid. That it's too easy for a small fleet to tag a large fleet. We'd really like to, so at the moment you need one ship for every 5 that you're trying to tag of the same class. Maybe make it equal, or 4/5, or 3/4 at the very least, so that the tagging force has to be substantial. Let's change the size of the circle. They could do a thing like they do with the PvP circles, that once you're in that circle, or like the noob zone, once you're in that circle, a little thing pops up to say you are in a port battle hostility zone, and the rules of engagement could morph. And then the other thing is smarter screen tagging. It's just too easy for either an alt, and we had another alt join one of our port battles today. He helped screw up some screening, and then he joined the port battle and then immediately left. And there is a tribunal system, but it's almost bloody impossible to prove that this person isn't simply an idiot and they are in fact a cheat. But this person's now done it 3 times in 3 different scenarios, so they should either have their keyboard removed because they're too stupid, or their account locked out for a week because they're a twat. But there should be smarter screen tagging, so maybe you allocate someone, you can give them a thing of being a screen commander or something, and when you're in the port battle area it's only their tags that instigate battle or something. But we need smarter screen tagging, or people in the outer circle get to choose whether or not they enter. I don't know, make the inner circle a bit bigger, the outer circle a bit smaller, and the outer circle gets to choose whether or not they enter. And then lastly we'll get on to port battles. So let's assume that naval action servers will be global, that they will expect that it's not all predominantly fought in a 6-hour block. Let's assume that's the case. There's basically 2 things we think that they could consider to change to stop night flipping, but allow everybody a chance to participate. So one of them, which I think would be a much bigger design challenge and require a lot more thought to make it work, one of them would be that a port battle itself doesn't actually just have one 2-hour event. The port battle lasts for 24 hours, and perhaps the main capital is fought in the key time zone, but then perhaps the towns around it, they can be attacked, and maybe they can be attacked in different time zones. So, or it's just the capital gets attacked repeatedly. So if we imagine there could be 5 or 6 battles, the results would be accumulated. You could weight them based on player load at the time they took place at, and then the winner of the port is the person, is the side that accumulatively did the best. So you could imagine 2 or 3 battles going on in the 8 to 10 hours of the day that makes up a European day, if that's when the port battle was sprung. You could imagine 1 to 2 battles taking place in what might be considered the US primary time, and 1 or 2 battles taking place in the oceanic time period, and it would be the accumulated tally of those that would discern the win. Now, of course, we're saying this without knowing what raids are. Maybe raids is the answer to everything, but I don't think so. I don't think they can be. The other thing would be that we sort of take a leaf from the old and a leaf from the new. So once you've set a port up, be that through hostility, or they're talking about these new admiral points as a way of essentially instigating a port conflict, it is fought within the time zone that was set by the Lord Protector. So whoever captured the port can set a time zone, maybe a 4 to 6 hour window, that once that port has been aggressed, the battle will take place inside that window. The attacker can choose when inside that window, so you're not having to sit there defending the port for 6 hours. And the defender knows 2 days in advance when the attack's happening. So let's just do a scenario. The British want to attack Orinoco. One of the British has either got the Admiralty points, if that's what we're going to get, or the British run up hostility. As they run up hostility, they can then choose the time of the attack as it hits 100%. and that time could only be within a 6-hour window as set by the defender. Now, should the British gloriously win the port, the British will then have to defend the port in that same 6-hour timer, and the attackers would have 1 or 2 attacks that they could mount in the week to try and retake it. However, if they fail, the British can now slide the timer on that port by 6 hours to the next slot. So effectively you could move your port defences around. So that way, if the Americans woke up at daft bastard o'clock and managed to take a Danish port in Danish prime time, once they defended it, they could maybe then start moving it closer to or forward or backwards towards an American suited time, which would require the Danes and their allies to put together a fleet outside of their normal hours and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's the nub of what was spoken about at the Diplomacy Forum table, the captain's table, the parley, the Diplomacy parley. Where do we expect there to be blood and thunder next week? Well, down here this is the Blood Sea. The Windward Islands and the coast of the sort of South America here, the north coast of South America. This is just a hotspot of battles at the moment. And I think Haiti's going to carry on being a bit of a biffin. In fact, I know the Brits set up a port battle with the French. So that's a good thing. There'll be the normal ganking going on where these little arrows are. That's where I would guess the biffo will be, but we can see. Now this week there's been quite a lot of movement because there's been 5 or 6 ports change hand. The Spanish, that should be break even, sorry, Spaniard. That should be break even. That's the first week, probably since the patch, they've not lost a port. Oh no, there was another week where no one won anything, second week. The British are gaining on them. The Americans go flying up the charts after all of their revenge, let's call it, against the Danes. The Swedes hold their own. The French have a net loss of 1. The Pirates hold their own. The Dutch have a net loss of 1. And the Danes have a net loss of 20. Ouch. Ouchie, ouchie. So there we go. I think I might have duffed that up. I think the Dutch got an extra port. But anyway, doesn't matter. That's it for this week's naval action. Again, numbers were up a little bit this week, despite the fact there's a lot of people getting pissed off with the night flipping and saying that they've left the game or leaving the game. Numbers were good this week. I'm getting contacted by folks coming back. A infamous British clan that joined the pirates in the middle of the last war have received letters of marque and have rejoined the British. So that's good because they're in my time zone. They're an Aussie clan, so that's good. So let's hope we still get some numbers coming back. Oh, and one more thing. Got on the forums. The devs have built a test server. I have to say, we're in early access. I don't really understand a test server. Anyway, there's some instructions on how you can get access to the test server. There's a thread on what they're testing. And there's probably 2 things of note, 2 things that you should know that are being tested on there. One of them is a thing where if you log off in open water, you won't be able to enter a port battle for 25 minutes unless you sail into a friendly port. This might be a bit ouchy for people who disconnect, I have to say, so you might have to take a couple of spares with you if you've got people, with crappy interwebs or whatever. And the second one is a huge change to the damage model, where they're sort of modelling cannonballs hitting modules more inside of the ship, so we can imagine damage to steering and rudder, and particularly to demasting, to now be something that can be done by, for example, stern raking a ship. No, I actually think they've got the damage model pretty good. I think it's a little bit too hard to sink 4th rates at the moment, 4th rate on 4th rate. But I think the 1st rate on 1st rate damage is pretty good. I think the 5th and 6th damage model is pretty good. The 2nd and 3rd rates really are only screening ships, but they don't feel too bad. But I think the recent high armour values on pretty much all the 4th rates now is too high compared to the penetration of the cannons they fire. And it basically means if you're more than 250 metres away, pretty much you're only penetrating your enemy with your bottom deck, and that means it takes too long to sink a ship. Anyhow, that's it for this week's naval action. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. I'll see you on the ocean, and I will catch you.